Joining us today are retired U.S. Army Colonel Jon Sweet and foreign affairs and security policy expert Mark Toth. Welcome to our program.
Hey, Sophia, thanks for having us back on the show.
Sophia, great to be here. Thank you.
Finnish President Alexander Stubb has indicated that Zelensky and Putin could meet at the G20 summit at the end of November. Mark, how realistic do you think such a meeting is? And at this stage, are there anything substantive that the Ukrainian leader could discuss with Russian dictator?
Sophia, my eyebrows raised when I saw that, because up till now, Putin has been a coward when it comes to meeting with Zelensky. He was willing to do it if Zelensky traveled to Moscow, but obviously Zelensky never would return from that trip. He would have been arrested, if not killed, en route. So for Putin to be hinting at this potentially, I just don't buy it. He's already announced that he doesn't intend to go to the G20 summit that's later in November in Johannesburg, and Trump himself has said that he's not going. At this point, it's really at a J.D. Vance level, vice president level, and I just don't see it happening. I think it is a well-intended effort by the Finnish president to try and see if he can't move this along. Certainly, two different countries, Kyrgyzstan and another, are willing to act as mediators. Both happen to be traveling their representatives to Russia in the next week or so. But I just don't see it happening. But if it were, what could they accomplish? I think it's difficult to know, because Putin is basically saying before he's willing to meet, if ever, is that basically NATO has to admit they're at fault, and Ukraine basically has to still give up its independence. Zelensky, on the other hand, very quickly here, is saying there's got to be a ceasefire before that he's willing to meet. So I think this is just all a well-intended effort, but there's not much behind it yet. I just don't see it happening.
And indeed, in Kyiv, we hear alert, I think, like every day. And even my hometown, Zaporizhia, is under attack, heavy attack, every day and every night, with drones, with missiles and other weapons which Russia has in its arsenal. And, this kind of attacks on civilian infrastructure, on civilians itself, don't look like Russian dictator is ready for a peace talks. And Jon, I just want to understand, what do you think? Do you see any willingness on Russian side basically to go deep and really sit down and negotiate?
No, and I agree with Mark. There's no intention by Russia to actually sit down and negotiate. The terms, again, that were provided to Marco Rubio for the negotiation, if you will, between Putin and Trump that would have been held in Budapest were the same terms that were provided weeks prior to that. And just as Mark said, it's the complete capitulation of Ukraine. And that's just simply not something that Zelensky is going to accept. Russia is going to continue its all-out blitz, if you will, from drones and ballistic missiles and full frontal assaults across the front. They're going to do that because they think that puts additional pressure upon Ukraine, and that's going to force Ukraine to the negotiation table. But right now it hasn't, because Ukraine's able to withstand those type of assaults, and then Ukraine's able to punch back in the terms of striking deep to within the Russian interior, hitting the oil refineries, but also hitting munition depots and hitting those production facilities that are actually putting together the drones. They've also successfully interdicted some deliveries of North Korean weapon systems as well. So as long as Ukraine's able to punch back, Ukraine's not going to submit to any Russian demands. And right now, as Mark and I have stated in several articles, Putin's increasingly desperate. He lacks victories on the battlefield. He's pushing his generals to provide those victories. The generals are telling him what he wants to hear, and therefore he continues to push a propaganda war as opposed to actual victories on the ground. So he's pushing really hard with his FSBs through social media to try to convince people that they're winning, when in fact they're coming up woefully short.
And here I want to go deep and discuss the situation on the battlefield, and also to touch on what you mentioned in your recent piece on Substack, because we know that Russian forces are attempting to capture Kupiansk, and heavy fighting is ongoing in Pokrovsk, Donetsk region. And according to President Zelensky, the occupiers have deployed around 170,000 troops in the Pokrovsk direction. Jon, from a military perspective, where do we stand right now?
Well, where we stand right now is a stalemate. What we're seeing is the Ukrainian forces within the interior of the city that are repelling Russian advances. But the Russians right now in the interior of the city aren't advancing with mechanized forces and human wave assaults. What they're advancing is by infiltration of small units that get into the city. And then once they get into the city, they go to ground, meaning that they establish defensive positions and they try to maintain that posture, interdicting, if you will, supply lines that are coming in and out of the city. So they're not necessarily occupying by force or occupying by small numbers. There was a great article that was written in the Kiev Post yesterday by Stefan Korshak that actually goes into great detail on this particular tactic and how the Russians are employing it, getting their foot into the ground and trying to expand from within as opposed to trying to overrun the city with mass force. Ukraine's been effective in repelling that, and they've been very effective in getting their small units, their special operators into the city to uproot them and to push them out. What they have to be concerned, obviously, with is Russia's ability to actually encircle the city. So there's a fight within the city, but there's also a broader fight to prevent Russia forces from actually encircling the city. And what you're seeing right now is a reposition of Ukrainian forces to do that. Whenever Russia moves, and this is one of the things that Ukraine is very successful at, whenever Russia moves, it exposes their infantry, exposes their armor to Ukrainian drone strikes. One of the principal battle systems that Ukraine uses in the front lines is their drones. And it's very effective and it's very detrimental against Russian forces. And we'll continue to see these type of attacks.
While it ends, battles continue on the front lines. The Russian dictator Vladimir Putin continues to claim victories, as you said. And just last week, he announced that both towns were encircled and even invited Western journalists to visit their contact line. Mark, what do you think is his purpose behind these statements and invitation of Western media?
Yeah, he needs to manufacture a win. Like a magician, he's trying to pull one out of his hat, and it's just not there. As Jon said, look, he's desperate. I'd even go one step further. I think Putin is cornered right now. Everywhere you look across the battle space, across the international space, across his own economy, Putin is facing heavy headwinds, and he's not gaining traction anywhere. And so, we had this instance where he comes out wearing what Jon likes to call a Baghdad Bob uniform, referring back to the Iraqi spokesman during the first Iraq War, who looked like he was wearing a uniform that had never seen battle, and trying to pretend that he's a general or trying to pretend that he's the head of the military in Moscow, but he's not achieving anything. So he's trying to achieve by words what his militaries have not been able to achieve on the ground. We've seen that in Kupiansk. I think, as Jon touched on, that's the one that probably Ukraine is more capable of withstanding in terms of those two thrusts that are coming down from the north. And so Putin is trying to talk his way into that victory, even going so far as to inviting journalists to come see it. But that didn't work and probably won't. And even in Kupiansk, he was saying the same thing. But on Halloween, basically, Budanov, your security genius in Ukraine, had a surprise waiting for him, basically saying, hey, we see what you're doing. We're willing to reinforce. Your leader, Putin, has just gone out and said on public TV that we're going to be taking this region. And Ukraine said no. And so there's an optics war there. So I think from Putin's standpoint, he's just cornered. And this bravado, if you will, coming out of him to try to claim that he's got victories or impending victories, be it in Kupiansk or in Pokrovsk, is simply him trying to pull the rabbit out of the hat. The problem is every time he looks for that rabbit in the hat with the audience watching, those of us on a global scale, it's just not there. And then, oh yeah, his economy is imploding. Ukraine continues to corner him by destroying his economy. And we've got sanctions that the U.S. is increasingly imposing on his major oil companies. So, last week we talked to Daniel and we talked about, Putin basically being desperate. This week, I'd argue, this story has evolved to the point where it really is all about Putin being cornered, and he's trying to get out of that corner.
And I also want to talk about another state, which is also Russian ally. It's Belarus, because the Belarusian Special Operation Command has suggested that Minsk could, if needed, deploy its so-called peacekeepers in Ukraine at the request of both sides. Jon, how do you assess this possibility of opening a second front in the northern Ukraine?
Yeah, I find that I found that amusing. This thought of peacekeeping forces. Let's go back to the invasion, and the Russian forces actually invaded Ukraine from Belarus. The helicopter assaults that came into the Kiev region, the airfields launched from Belarus. The ballistic missiles that were fired from Belarus. The wounded Russian soldiers were evacuated to field hospitals in Belarus. So Belarus is up to its neck in Putin problems. Belarus understands that if Putin fails, they fail. And Belarus looks to the West and they see Poland. Okay, and they understand that Poland is a threat to them. So they're going to flex as much as they can. They keep telling everyone we have nuclear weapons, we have this ballistic missile, this hypersonic missile. We'll use them if we need to. But that is just what it is. It's scared talk. And Belarus, by all means, is not a peacekeeping force. Belarus would be a force of occupation. It is simply not going to be accepted by any of the Western countries.
And indeed, we see and we saw that last week Belarusian dictator and self-proclaimed President Alexander Lukashenko threatened the world and the Western countries, talking about this Russian Oreshnik missile and deployment of this missile in Belarus. And at the same time, Belarus has recently stepped up attacks on Lithuania using weather balloons. Mark, what do you think is behind this recent escalation, and what's your take on the situation with Belarus right now?
Right, now as we pass the 3.5-year mark since Putin invaded in 2022, and arguably we should go back to 2014 when he invaded Donetsk and seized the Crimea, Lukashenko's come up with these boasts, and that's about all he's good for. Clearly, he's trying to play Putin and show that he's on his side. Message to him that, they're all kumbaya and that he's going to be there. But when it comes to the end of the day, Lukashenko hasn't done anything substantive, at least on an overt basis, other than what Jon just mentioned in the initial stages of the war by allowing Russian troops to invade from the north into going south towards Ukraine. That said, look, Belarus is involved in this war. It is a hybrid war aspect of it. Putin desperately, again, hitting on this theme of being cornered, desperately needs a distraction right now. And the latest one through a hybrid means are likely these weather balloons, or not weather balloons, but these balloons, if you will, that are crossing over, estimated at 60 plus, that went from Belarusian airspace and violated Lithuanian airspace and basically interrupted 170 flights out of different Lithuanian airports. It's just one way of doing that, causing chaos, if you will, testing responses, their efforts there. And so from that standpoint, I think what Belarus is trying to do is play its part in a hybrid way, even though they're claiming this was about cigarette smuggling. Not likely. This was probably intentional. Lithuania certainly sees it that way. Gitanas Nausėda, the president of Lithuania, certainly sees it that way. And then I would remind, just on the scheme of things, this whole distraction idea, viewers, that look, last September, despite heavy setbacks military-wise inside of Ukraine, Russia decided to go ahead and do the Zapad military exercises that happen every 4 years in Belarus. And in Zapad, for Western viewers, Zapad means West. It's the idea of going west, confronting NATO, et cetera. So that's messaging to it. So Putin wants to use Belarus as messaging to NATO, is messaging to the Baltic states, stay out of this, but so far it's not working. Every time he attempts to do that, to try to get out of this corner that he's in, he only invites a stronger response coming from NATO, from Poland, from the Baltic states. And we're seeing that. Just real quickly here, one of the ways is that Lithuania has sealed its border now, or flights, if you will, not border, for a month coming from Belarus, and they've threatened to derail as well, which would hurt the Belarusian economy. So again, an example of using Belarus as messaging, but it's not going to get Putin out of the corner that he's in.
Now I want to shift our topic also and talk about the new Russian weapons and more exactly about the answer as we see it in Kyiv from the American side. Because according to media reports, the US has planned its first test of an intercontinental ballistic missile capable of carrying a nuclear warhead, following Donald Trump's order to resume nuclear weapons testing. Mark, do you think we are returning to a Cold War era dynamics where the arms race set the global agenda? And I'm also curious why Moscow and Washington raising the nuclear stakes now.
Yeah, no, it's amazing how this story is taking off. I just was contacted by Egyptian national TV before we came on, wanting to talk about this very subject because it's gotten everyone's attention. I think, however, though, that people need to look at this at a little bit higher altitude. Basically, Putin attempted to do a power play on Trump by the announcement of this this loitering capability missile that they have that can stay in space and is invincible, as he put it. And Trump wasn't having anything of it. And so he responded by saying, okay, the U.S. hasn't tested weapons since September of 1992. But we're going to get back in that business. So I think a lot of this is just messaging. It's pushing back. And I think part of it also, what I would also suggest people take a look at, there's more to this than just the nuclear aspect of it. There's also the fact that Sergei Lavrov, appears to have been at least temporarily sidelined a bit here because he's the one that is alleged to have overplayed this hand of saying, look, get tough with Trump instead of buttering him up, threaten nuclear weapons. And it failed. And so suddenly you had Kirill Dmitriev flying to the U.S. last week, attempting to tamp things down with Steve Witkoff, Trump's special envoy, and that didn't work. He was only found himself being rebuked by Scott Bessent, the U.S. Treasury Secretary. So, getting back to the nuclear aspect of this, and John probably can get a little bit more detailed on the actual weapon system itself. I think this is just Trump messaging back. I think he intends to do it. I think he gets the double messaging here, not just to Putin, but to China as well. But I think this has more to do with anything. If I were to write the headline, it's just simply all about Putin being cornered, thinking that he could get out of that corner by threatening nukes, and Trump saying, you're not going to scare me. It was just a dumb move on the part of Putin, and Trump called him out on it. John?
No, it's I agree with everything Mark said. And look, this really goes back, I think, to some degree to the Biden administration, early stages of the war, when the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Mark Milley, had a conversation with Gerasimov, the Russian general, over the Russian forces, and he asked him, what are those conditions that would cause Russia to use nuclear weapons? And Gerasimov provided those conditions. But and it's the same time, I think the Biden administration at that time provided, showed their hand that they were worried about nuclear escalation, nuclear retaliation. Russia heard that loud and clear, and we have seen since that point, every time something goes against Russia, the introduction of HIMARS, the introduction of M1A1 tanks, the Patriot missile system being brought in to the country, the response from Putin has always been an escalatory response involving nuclear weapons, whether it was an actual exercise of his strategic nuclear forces or visibly showing, the nuclear football with his aid to any type, and to static displays of weapon systems during his pod. That's their fallback. The difference is it worked on the Biden administration. It's not working with the Trump administration.
And you also probably read this report from the Washington Post that preparing the U.S. to resume nuclear tests could take years. And John, I'm really interested, how would you assess the readiness from your perspective and from your experience?
Sure. So the Strategic Command that actually handles our nuclear programs is an Air Force program, primarily a joint program as well. But every confidence that they maintain readiness, that the weapon systems are maintained and can be called upon when and if needed. We have processes, procedures in place that secure that weapon and ensure that everyone, upon issue of any order, acts in accordance to the plans. I don't think it will come to that, but I do believe this is, as Mark said, this is strategic messaging. This is telling Russia, I have the weapon, just like you. I can use the weapon in retaliation of what you do. It is not a first fire weapon system from the United States, but it is something that assures an 80s doctrine, which was mutual assured destruction. And I believe Putin understands mutual assured destruction. So while he flexes that I have nuclear weapons and I can do X, Y, and Z, he also knows that the United States and NATO have nuclear weapons and retaliate in kind, and that balances the equation. So yes, we may say that we're going to do nuclear type of, I want to say exercises, but testing nuclear weapons. I think it's more along the lines of testing the delivery systems of those weapons. We haven't seen an above ground or below ground detonation in at least the United States in decades. I don't think we're going to see one now. Most of these things now can be done without the actual detonation of the weapon.
And yesterday, on Monday, we heard very good news for Ukraine. Britain has announced new additional Storm Shadow missiles to protect Ukrainian sky and Ukrainian infrastructure against Russian strikes. And just past weekend, we also saw blackouts, not in Moscow itself, but in the Moscow region. Mark, do you expect the number of these strikes on Russia to continue increasing?
Yeah, I think as Zelensky said and Trump's acknowledged, the best sanctions so far against Russia have really been in the form of deep strikes. And the Storm Shadow has been effective in doing that. And I think Ukraine gets it because, back in mid-October, I think around October 21st, they even came out, which I was a little bit surprised, and said that they struck the Bryansk chemical plant using a Storm Shadow, which was notable, basically saying, look, we've got these that traveled the 500 kilometers or so there to undertake that attack, and it destroyed it, and it's certainly capable of doing that. I think the bigger messaging of the Storm Shadows, though, and in conjunction with the sanctions that the U.S. Imposed upon Rosneft and Lukoil, the two largest oil companies in Russia, is that we're going to continue to go after military targets as well as your economic targets to try to bring Putin to his knees, to corner him yet one more way. And it's being effective. So Storm Shadows and their French equivalent have played a huge role. And it's good news that the UK continues to stock those up in terms of heading into winter, because as you just pointed out, Ukraine at its option can decide that, they're going to focus on taking out energy targets as well that can disrupt the economy, can disrupt the supply chain in Russia, getting things transported to Ukraine, to the battlefronts and everything, and that's good. John certainly can envision different uses of those Storm Shadows. So let me quickly flip to him and see what else he thinks that they can accomplish.
Yeah, Sophia, my comment's this. Ukraine's currently fighting 4 battles, actually 5 if you talk about the battle of propaganda and salesmanship. But the one battle that they're winning in, the one battle that they're successful in, that they're inflicting pain upon Russia, is that deep fight. It's striking those refineries. It's striking their production facilities. It's taking out the electrical grids of major cities that affect Russian citizens, not the ethnic minorities, but rather the Russian citizen. But that's at a cost, okay? They're focused on that, and they are simply, when I say simply, they are simply surviving the close fight, which is the fight in the trenches, the fight in the cities. They're holding the Russian advances, right? Banking, counting on the deep fight, winning the war. And they're also holding their own in what I would call the rear fight, which is the fight against the drones and the ballistic missiles that are impacting their cities. That is all about holding and surviving. The one piece that they have to turn their attention to, they have to pay more in resources to, is that war of interdiction. As long as Russia can continue to flow troops and supplies and materials and weapon systems into Ukraine, the longer this continues to go. Yes, Russia is losing 7,000 soldiers a week, but they're replenishing 7,000 soldiers a week. It has to be some effort, some additional effort allocated towards those forces. You said there were 170,000 forces in the Donetsk region, and that may be true, but they're coming from somewhere and they have to be struck. Why not strike them in their assembly areas and their marshalling areas? Why wait for them to come to the battlefield? And that's where you assume a lot of risk by forcing your soldiers to fight them individually as opposed to taking them out. So I do believe interdiction still is the key Storm Shadow missile is a good weapon system for interdiction, as are HIMARS and ATACMS and the cluster munitions.
And the last topic which I want to discuss today with you is also sanctions, which you already touched on a bit. And we know it's already more than 1 week since President Trump announced his first sanctions against Russia during his second term as a president. And just according to recent Bloomberg reports, Chinese refineries are refusing Russian oil. And I just want to see and to know your opinion on the first results of the sanctions. What kind of results have you seen so far? And do you think these measures are effective? And has Trump achieved what he intended to achieve with these sanctions against Russia? Mark, go ahead.
I think, right. Sophia, he has. He has. As John, likes to say, and John's exactly right about this. It's not just the action that it counts. It's the reaction that you want to pay attention to. And in the reaction to these latest sanctions that the U.S. imposed, as I mentioned a little bit before, on Rosneft and Lukoil, the two largest gas companies inside of Russia, was basically for Kirill Dmitriev, Putin's special envoy, the head of the Russian Sovereign Fund, to skedaddle, to use an American term, meaning run quickly, to Washington to try and meet with Steve Witkoff. Turned out it was in Pennsylvania, to be accurate. But it didn't work. And so that reaction, that Russian reaction, if you will, tells us that Putin is very concerned about it. And the effect was immediate, because if you're seeing that, that means Putin got the message that the U.S. is getting serious about this. Now, what it's had, and I think somewhat surprisingly, is there's no secondary sanctions attached to it yet. So in other words, China, India, and that's where Russia today still sells 85% of its oil now. They had a little bit longer leash to keep buying that oil, but they decided both to pull back because they're fearing if that Russian unrefined oil gets into their pipeline and they start to refine it in their refineries, that it may be faced with secondary sanctions. So it also had a double effect, a good effect, in that it stopped, or at least curtailed would be the better word, not stopped, Chinese and Indian purchases of Russian oil. So that's a good thing. So these sanctions, surprisingly had more effect than we initially thought. And I think the fact that it just shows just how desperate Putin is in terms of Dmitriev traveling to the U.S. within days of those sanctions being imposed, because Putin realizes that without that economic lifeline that India and China have given him through the purchases of Russian oil, he's in trouble. So I would, give high marks for this. Trump, gets an A+ here because it's had an immediate effect.
John, and
I agree. I was just going to add that, look, I agree with everything Mark said. Putin thought he would be able to play through this because he assumed that the fellow BRICS nations would stand up and help him. And what he's seeing is that alliance, that economic alliance, is not, and that has scared him. So he's going to try to go faster and fight harder in order to offset that. But I don't think we've seen the full effect of the sanctions yet. It will take a couple of weeks, maybe a month before we see that. And by then we will be into the Russian winter months and it will have an impact.
Thank you for this discussion today. And thank you for your time and sharing your thoughts and your expertise on this topic.
Great to be back on the show, Sophia. Thank you.
Great, Sophia. Thank you so much. Take care. Be safe.